It was a different America then. If you could step back into the silence of 1860, before the thunder broke, you would hear a country arguing with itself, not in the coarse shout of battle, but in the tense, hushed tones of a family dinner gone wrong. It was a land of distinct smells, the coal smoke of the northern foundries mixing with the salt air of Boston Harbor, and the sweet, heavy scent of magnolias and sweat hanging over the cotton fields of the Delta. They spoke the same language, read the same Bible, and cherished the same revolution. Yet they looked at each other across a widening chasm, strangers in the same house. In the autumn of that year, a great comet appeared in the sky, trailing a tail of fire across the zenith. To the superstitious, and there were many, it was a celestial warning, a writing on the wall that the old order was ending. Down in the deep south, the fire eaters preached that the election of a prairie lawyer from Illinois would mean the end of their civilization. Up north, they marched in torchlight parades, calling him the rail splitter, unaware that the wood he would soon split was the Union itself. When the news came over the telegraph wires that Abraham Lincoln had won, the South did not wait for his shadow to darken the White House door. One by one, the stars began to fall from the flag. The war did not begin with a scream, but with a pageant, all in Charleston Harbor, April 1861. The mood was not one of dread, but of festive anticipation. Ladies in hoop skirts and men in fine linen climbed to the rooftops, opera glasses in hand, as if attending a regatta. Mary Chestnut, a woman of sharp wit and heavy heart, sat on her roof in Charleston and wrote in her diary of the sound and fury as the first mortars traced lazy arcs of fire toward Fort Sumter. It was a gentleman's duel, a bombardment that lasted 34 hours, pulverizing brick and mortar, yet, by some miracle of ballistics, killing not a single soul. When the American flag was lowered in surrender, the crowd cheered. Toasts were drunk with Madeira, and the illusion of a bloodless divorce seemed, for a fleeting moment, real. But the silence that followed Sumter was the intake of breath before a scream. In Washington and Richmond, the drums began to beat. Walt Whitman heard them in New York. A relentless beat. Beat. Drums. Blow. Bugles. Blow. That shattered the peace of the bridal chamber and the schoolroom. They rushed to enlist. Boys who had never been more than 20 miles from their farms, driven by a naive chivalry and the terrifying fear that the war would be over before they could buy a uniform. They posed for stiff, sepia-toned photographs, clutching Bowie knives and revolvers, eyes wide with the romance of a fiction they were about to write in blood. Among them was a Rhode Island lawyer named Sullivan Ballou. In the quiet of a camp near Washington, days before the first great battle, he sat down to write a letter to his wife, Sarah. He did not write of glory, but of a love deathless and binding him with mighty cables. He spoke of the soft breeze that would fan her cheek as his spirit passing by. It was the voice of a generation saying goodbye to its innocence, sensing, with a tragic prescience, that the picnic of war was a lie. He would never see Rhode Island again. His ashes would be lost in the chaos to come, but his words would remain, a haunting whisper of the cost of duty. July 1861, Manassas. The heat was a physical weight, pressing down on the green hills of Virginia, where the two amateur armies collided. They called it the First Battle of Bull Run, but it felt more like a carnival gone mad. Civilians from Washington rode out in carriages with picnic baskets and champagne, expecting to watch the rebellion crushed in an afternoon. The uniforms were a kaleidoscope of confusion. Union men in gray, Confederates in blue, Zouaves in baggy red trousers, friend and foe indistinguishable in the dust and smoke. It began with the confident march of the North. But as the afternoon sun blazed, the tide turned on the pivot of a single Virginian standing like a stone wall. The air filled with a sound never heard before on this continent, the high, trembling shriek of the rebel yell, a noise that froze the blood. The Union lines, brittle and untested, shattered. The retreat became a rout, a great skedaddle where soldiers threw down their muskets and ran through the picnickers, overturning carriages, mixing the screams of the wounded with the hysteria of the elite. The illusion of a short war died on that road back to Washington. The picnic was over, and the long, dark night had begun. The year turned, and the war grew colder, harder and vast. By 1862, the conflict had spilled over the mountains into the west, where a quiet man named Ulysses S. Grant was teaching the world the terrible arithmetic of modern wars. At a place called Shiloh, a Hebrew word meaning place of peace, the devil came to collect his due. It was a battle fought in the woods, a confused, grappling struggle where men fired at muzzle flashes in the gloom. The peach orchard was in full bloom, and survivors would later recall how the bullets cut the petals from the trees, letting them fall like pink snow upon the open eyes of the dead. Shiloh was not a battle. It was a slaughterhouse. More men fell in those 2 days than in all the wars America had fought previously, combined. At the center of the line, in a sunken road dubbed the Hornet's Nest, the sound of bullets was so thick it sounded like angry insects swarming. Near a small pond, wounded men from both sides crawled to drink, their blood turning the water a murky red, creating a bloody pond that would stain the national memory forever. When the smoke cleared, the nation looked at the casualty lists and realized, with a collective shudder, that this was no longer a war of chivalry. It was a war of extermination. While the West bled, the East held its breath. The Union Army, a massive, sluggish leviathan under George McClellan, moved toward Richmond with the speed of a glacier. They could hear the church bells of the Confederate capital, see the spires in the distance, but they lacked the iron will to close the hand. And then, from the shadow of the defensive lines, emerged a figure of gray legend, Robert E. Lee, a man of courtly manners and audacious violence, took command in the 7 days battles. Lee did the unexpected. He did not defend. He attacked with a ferocity that stunned the North. He hurled his smaller army against the Union juggernaut, hammering them back from the gates of Richmond. The swamps of the peninsula turned red, and the Union soldiers, who had expected victory, found themselves fighting for survival in the mud and malaria. The gathering storm had fully broken. The naive boys of 1861 were gone, replaced by hollow-eyed veterans who knew now that the only way home lay through the fire. The war had ceased to be a question of politics. It had become a crucible, burning away the old America to forge something new, something terrible, and something as yet undefined. The sun rose on September 17th, 1862, over the rolling hills of Sharpsburg, Maryland. Not as a bringer of light, but as a spotlight on a slaughterhouse. This was Antietam, the day the war stopped being a conflict and became a catastrophe. In the early morning mist, a 30-acre cornfield stood tall and green, the stalks rustling in the breeze. By noon, not a single stalk was left standing. They were cut down not by scythes, but by a hailstorm of lead so thick that one survivor, Charles Carleton Coffin, remembered the sound beginning like pattering drops upon a roof before swelling into a roll, crash, roar, and rush. Like a mighty ocean billow, men from Wisconsin and Texas, who had never met, slaughtered each other among the corn until the ground itself turned a muddy crimson. To the center of the line, there was a sunken farm road, worn down by years of wagon wheels. By the afternoon, it had earned a new name, Bloody Lane. The Confederates used it as a natural trench, piling bodies in front of them like sandbags. When the Union troops finally broke through, they found the dead lying 3 deep, their faces turned to the sky in a grotesque mosaic of sacrifice. The air was thick with the copper smell of blood and the sulfur of black powder, a fog so dense that men fired at muzzle flashes, killing ghosts in the gloom. It was the single bloodiest day in American history. 0 casualties in 12 hours. More Americans fell there than on the beaches of Normandy. Yet when the sun finally set, the lines had barely moved. But out of this river of blood, a new purpose was born. Abraham Lincoln, who had been waiting for a victory to speak the words that burned in his pocket, saw the retreat of Robert E. Lee as a sign from the Almighty. He did not issue the Emancipation Proclamation with the roar of a cannon, but with the quiet scratch of a pen. It was a dry, legalistic document, dull as a bill of lading, yet its spirit was thunder. On New Year's Day, 1863, the war changed. It was no longer just about preserving a map. It was about purifying a soul in the slave quarters of the Deep South, where the news traveled by the mysterious grapevine telegraph. There was a silent, trembling joy. Frederick Douglass, waiting by the wire in Boston, described the moment the news arrived. The scene was wild and grand. Joy and gladness exhausted all forms of expression. But in the camps, the mood was darker. Many Union soldiers, who had signed up to save the Union, felt betrayed. They wrote home in anger, refusing to fight for the Negro. Yet, as they marched past the plantations and saw the scars on the backs of the enslaved, a slow, grudging moral awakening began to take root. They were fighting for human liberty. Whether they liked it or not, summer came, and with it, the heat. July 1863 brought the war to a small market town in Pennsylvania that no one had ever heard of, Gettysburg. It was an accident of roads, a collision of shoes and desperate men. For 2 days, the armies mauled each other across wheat fields and peach orchards. The noise of battle heard as far away as Pittsburgh. On the third day, a silence fell. It was 1 o'clock in the afternoon. A Union private remembered it being almost as still as a Sabbath day. The heat was suffocating, the air shimmering above the stone walls where the Union soldiers waited. Then, the forest on the other side of the field seemed to detach itself and move forward. Sure. 000 Confederate soldiers, the flower of the South, stepped into the open. It was a parade of death. Flags snapped in the breeze. Bayonets glurned like a river of silver. They marched toward the center of the Union line with a terrible, suicidal beauty. Pickett's charge was not a charge. It was a slow walk into a blast furnace. As they crossed the Emmitsburg Road, the Union artillery opened up. Great gaps were torn in the gray lines, but they closed them up. Close up, men, close up, and kept walking. They reached the stone wall, a few desperate souls leaping over to grapple hand to hand. But the wave broke. The high water mark of the Confederacy was reached, and then it receded, leaving behind a field carpeted with the broken bodies of the South's youth. Robert E. Lee, watching from the ridge, rode out to meet the survivors, tears in his eyes, whispering, "It is all my fault." While the guns roared in Pennsylvania, a different kind of horror was unfolding 1,000 miles away on the Mississippi River. Vicksburg, the city on the bluff, had been under siege for 47 days. Ulysses S. Grant had locked the door and thrown away the key. Inside the city, civilization had collapsed into a primitive struggle for existence. The shelling was so constant that the citizens dug caves into the yellow clay hillsides, living like troglodytes. A woman in the city wrote in her diary of the terror of the mortars, of a mother's scream when a shell buried her child alive in the earth. Hunger became a madness. They ate mules, then dogs, and finally, the unthinkable. In the marketplace, skinned rats were hung up for sale, dressed like rabbits. A resident noted with grim irony that when properly fried, they tasted like squirrel. On July 4th, 1863, the same day Lee began his long, rainy retreat from Gettysburg, Vicksburg surrendered. The Father of Waters flowed unvexed to the sea. The Confederacy had been cut in two. Its spine snapped. The twin victories were a jubilee for the North, a double blow that should have ended the war. But wars do not end when they should. They end when the will to fight is utterly crushed. The South was broken, bleeding, and starving, but it would not yield. The fields of fire were behind them, but the longest, darkest shadow was yet to cast its length across the land. The era of the Gentleman's War was dead. The era of total war was about to begin. The year turned to 1864, and the war stripped off its last mask of romance. There were no more dashing cavaliers, no more delusions of a 90-day adventure. There was only the grinding, mechanical arithmetic of Ulysses S. Grant. He came east not to outmaneuver Robert E. Lee, but to destroy him. Grant understood a terrible truth that others had missed. The strength of the Confederacy was not its cities or its territory, but its army. He told Lincoln his plan in words as blunt as a sledgehammer. "I will chew them up." And so, he stepped into the tangled, second-growth forest of Virginia, known as the Wilderness, bringing with him a war of attrition that would stain the very soul of the nation. May 1864. The Wilderness was a place where the sun could barely touch the ground. The fighting was blind. A frantic grappling in the gloom where regiments fired into the underbrush at sounds, not sights. Then, the horror began. The muzzle flashes ignited the dry leaves of the previous autumn. The woods caught fire. The sound that rose from that burning forest was not the roar of battle, but a high, thin wailing that haunted veterans until their dying days. Wounded men, pinned by fallen timber or broken legs, watched the flames creep toward them. They screamed for comrades to kill them, to save them from the fire. A Union officer remembered seeing a man load his rifle, place the muzzle against his own heart, and pull the trigger as the wall of heat consumed him. It was Dante's Inferno brought to earth, a hell on earth where the smoke smelled of roasting flesh and pine resin. Yet, when the battle ended, the unthinkable happened. In the past, Union armies, bloodied and bruised, had always retreated north to lick their wounds. But that night, at the crossroads, the soldiers saw a lone figure on a horse, cigar glowing in the dark. Pointing not north, but south, a cheer went up, wild, guttural, defiant. They were marching into the valley of the shadow of death. But they were marching forward. They clashed again at Spotsylvania, at a place called the Bloody Angle. It was 20 hours of hand-to-hand combat, the most intense of the war. Men stabbed each other through the chinks in log breastworks. They grabbed enemy muskets and fired them back. The dead piled up in layers, trampled into the mud by the living, until the trenches were level with the ground. A single oak tree, 22 inches thick, was gnawed completely in half by rifle bullets alone, crashing down on the men beneath it, a testament to the sheer volume of lead that filled the air. At Cold Harbor, the soldiers knew they were being sent to die. In the pre-dawn light, a staff officer noticed a strange rustling in the lines. The men were sewing jagged slips of paper onto the backs of their coats. They were writing their names and addresses, so their bodies could be identified by their mothers. It was a mass suicide note. 7,000 men fell in 20 minutes, a rate of killing that sickened even the hardened Grant. The diary of a Confederate soldier that day read simply, "This is not war, this is murder." While Grant held Lee in a death grip in Virginia, William Tecumseh Sherman was unleashed on Georgia. Sherman was a man of nervous energy and ruthless logic. He believed that to end the war, he had to break the spirit of the Southern people. War is cruelty, he told the mayor of Atlanta, and you cannot refine it. He cut his supply lines, turning his army into a self-sustaining locust swarm. They marched to the sea, cutting a swath of destruction 60 miles wide. They tore up railroad tracks, heating the iron over bonfires and twisting them around trees into Sherman's neckties. They burned barns, ate the livestock, and left nothing behind but chimney sentinels. Lone brick stacks standing amidst the ashes of plantation houses. Behind the army followed a miles-long procession of liberated slaves, singing hymns, seeing Sherman not as a destroyer, but as a rough-hewn Moses parting the Red Sea of bondage. April 1865. The end came not with a bang, but with a stillness. The Confederate Army, now a ragged band of skeletons, was cornered near a tiny village called Appomattox Courthouse. It was Palm Sunday. The air was soft with spring. The dogwoods were in bloom. Robert E. Lee dressed in his finest uniform, a pristine gray with a sash of red silk and a ceremonial sword. "I must go and see General Grant," he said, the words tasting of ash, "and I would rather die 1,000 deaths." He rode to the home of Wilmer McLean, a man who, by a supreme irony of fate, had moved there to escape the war after the first Battle of Bull Run had been fought in his backyard. The war had literally followed him to his parlor. Grant arrived late, splattered with mud, wearing a private's coat with tarnished shoulder straps. He looked like a man who had just come from a hard day's work, which indeed he had. There was no gloating. They spoke of old army days, of Mexico, avoiding the subject at hand until Lee gently guided them back. The terms were generous. "Go home," Grant said. "Take your horses. You'll need them for the spring plowing." When Lee rode away, Union bands began to strike up a victory tune. Grant immediately ordered them to stop. "The war is over," he said. "The rebels are our countrymen again." A silence fell over the hills, a silence so profound that men said they could hear the birds singing for the first time in 4 years. But the final casualty was yet to fall. 5 days later, in Washington, The city was drunk with joy. Flags draped every balcony. The Capitol dome was illuminated. Abraham Lincoln, his face etched with the fatigue of 1,000 sleepless nights, went to Ford's Theater to see a comedy. He wanted to laugh. He sat in the rocking chair, holding Mary's hand. "We have had a hard time of it since we came to Washington," he whispered to her. "But the storm is over." At that moment, the door opened. A pop, muffled by laughter from the stage, rang out. The president slumped forward. The architect of the Union, the man who had steered the ship through the hurricane, would not live to see the port. He died the next morning in a cramped boarding house room across the street, too tall for the bed he lay on. "Now," whispered Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, "he belongs to the ages." The armies disbanded. The Grand Review in Washington saw thousands of soldiers marching down Pennsylvania Avenue, their bayonets reflecting the sun. A river of steel flowing into history. But as they marched, the phantom columns marched with them. The 620,000 dead. They returned to a different country. The South was a moonscape of ruin. Its social order overturned, its economy shattered. The North was an industrial giant, forging the modern world. But in the farmhouses and tenements, in the empty chairs at dinner tables, the war lived on. It lived in the empty sleeves of veterans, in the widows wearing black for the rest of their lives, in the eyes of the emancipated millions who now faced a new, colder war for dignity. The Civil War did not really end in 1865. It sank into the groundwater of America. It became the ghost in the attic, the unfinished conversation, the scar that aches when the weather turns. It proved that the Union could be held together by force, but it left the question of whether it could be held together by justice for future generations to answer. As the sun set on the 19th century, the old veterans would gather for reunions. Graybeards in blue and gray would shake hands across the stone walls of Gettysburg, weeping for the boys they once were. They are all gone now. The wind blows over the grass at Antietam. The traffic hums past the wilderness. But if you listen closely, in the quiet of the evening, you can still hear them, the faint, rhythmic tramp of boots, the murmur of voices asking us, the living, not to forget the cost of our Union,